Okay, and so to officially introduce ourselves, I'm Megan Gafford. I'm an artist and writer based in New York City, and we are here with Alastair Benn, who is the deputy editor of Engelsberg Ideas, who writes regularly on culture, art, and history. And you have a number of essays on literacy and the concept of Bildung, which is what we're going to talk about today. In our salon description, I defined Bildung as being like strength training for the soul. You're using resistance and a variety of weighty exercises to cultivate a holistic ideal. It is a lifelong journey of unifying key qualities of a cohesive self, including education, cultural refinement, the capacity to introspect, one's relationship to society, and the pursuit of virtue. The process is necessarily individualized, but never isolated, as the self learns by interacting with its surroundings. And so before we dive in, Alistair, how would you expand or clarify my definition? And what role does literacy play in Bildung?
Well, it's an excellent definition, but I think we can go back to where does the word come from? It's a German word. Bildung translates very poorly into English. It means something like self-picturing. It's built as a kind of picture. So, what does self-picturing mean? It's sort of that's not really a word in English, but it's probably more like self-realization and piggybacks in a way on centuries of theory in the Western tradition on what it means to be educated or to be cultured. And you have concepts that like paideia and then humanitas during the Renaissance. But Bildung is a peculiar German term and peculiar to German culture for several reasons. So where does it first gain prominence? It has roots in what is called the Pietist tradition, which is basically the kind of German popular response to the culture of Reformation. So it's how Reformation kind of spreads through what at this point are the German lands. There's a kind of there's lots of kind of centres set up around Germany and throughout Europe, which focus on this kind of it's sort of very inner questioning. It takes the kind of culture of surveillance that you have of inner surveillance that you have in a lot of Puritan thought and in Calvin, and it kind of says, well, inner questionings. You've got to have the cultivation of the inner world, but also you have this external world. So that's why they have all these institutions and charities. So there's that. The second thing to say is that Germany kind of is a Johnny come lately to the culture of enlightenment on the one hand, and the culture of a kind of industrial technological change on the other that hits Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century. So if we zoom into that period, you see that Germany is not the center of thought and letters and ideas in Europe. It is a backwater. It is Frederick the Great despises use of German in courts. It's seen as aspirational to use French. German is not even the language of kind of literature and thought in Germany. It's French. So, and on two fronts, Germany is kind of reacting to what's happening elsewhere. The technological revolution in England and the kind of burgeoning power and might that's happening there, and the kind of growing awareness that something is going on in England with the
Mm-hmm.
agglomeration of capital and industry. Something's going on, and we don't know what it is, sort of thing. And the same is true also of the culture of France and the kind of dynamism of the French Revolution and the culture of French Revolution. If you look at accounts of, say, Goethe, one of the great thinkers of the age, reacting to when he goes to witness the Battle of Valmy, which was one of the great battles in the kind of Revolutionary Wars, he doesn't just see the Battle of Valmy as some kind of French battle that is taking place in the context of some local politics. He sees it as a new age for the world. This is something that is disrupting everything. So I think people in the German-speaking lands in this period have got this sense of like things are happening in other places that we don't quite get. We're trying to, and things are becoming very unbalanced. How do we react? They've also got this sense of powerlessness because the how it then unfolds in the decades after is that Germany is partitioned and invaded and occupied in the Napoleonic period. So there's this kind of constant sense that German culture is a bit second rate, and also the kind of old princely courtly culture of Germany is not uh, setting us up to resist kind of the big forces of our time. So, but Bildung is a really important part of the way in which Germans begin to, people in the German-speaking world, start reacting to these problems. It says that, through this kind of inner cultivation of the mind and this kind of self-picturing, you can then start going out into the external world and start living a kind of new reality. And it becomes a kind of cult of the literary classes. And that's manifested in literature massively. It's and especially in the Bildungsroman, which is the concept that we know Bildung best in the English speaking world. And what is special about the Bildungsroman? Number one, it's the thing that starts to be exported in the other direction from Germany. It's a literary model that is embraced in the Anglophone world and in French literature in a way that previously German-speaking culture had been receiving these lots of concepts. So, you know, and what's special about the Bildungsroman, you see it in Goethe's Wilhelm Meister. It's a naive always male subject. It's of its time, a naive subject who goes through a series of kind of quests or a series of challenges that then changes the way they relate to the world, and it ends typically with a kind of the naive, immature subject becomes the mature person who starts a family and is integrated into the rest of the world. And yeah, it becomes a kind of Bildung is just one of these concept words that is so embraced by the kind of German wider bourgeois class in that period. It's something that keeps them going in a really tough period. And then the story continues, but we can go on to
that. To linger on the history for a moment, how does the concept of Bildung fit into the romantic backlash against the Enlightenment that we see in Germany and in Goethe's time, and with Goethe himself starting off as being a romantic and then later calling it a sickness or a poison? And then is it fair to credit Goethe with secularizing the concept of Bildung, making it something that kind of breaks the bounds of a Christian worldview?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots going on there. I think it is Bildung. I think there's this real sense, basically, that life is very unbalanced. That again, to come back to this idea that on the one hand, technology is completely transforming everything. And Goethe was familiar with some of the latest technology in his work as an administrator. And he's very conscious of this fact. He constantly talks about how our reach is exceeding our grasp. We have all this new power, Macht, and this is unsettling the world. And on the other, there's the kind of political and romantic sides, which again is unsettling the lens and the balance. It's introducing all these kinds of new ideas. One which is really I guess a good example is the sort of cult of returning to nature that the French Revolution that kind of is one of the kind of guiding spirits of the French Revolution. This obsession with turning the clock back to create a new society. So everything is really unsettled, and Romanticism is obviously part of that. I'd say that Goethe is super important, but I think the key text for people here, if they want to understand quite quickly what the culture of Bildung was, is to read Friedrich Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man, which is not a very long text and is kind of just a beautiful essay um, about reconciling choice and freedom and reconciling this kind of inner questing with the world outside. So I think if there's one text that you could read in an afternoon, which kind of gets you into a lot of these debates they were having about this kind of unsettling of the world, then that would be it. It's very eloquent, very well written, and it's not full of. It's written in quite clear, simple language, which again is
And
a problem. Yeah.
do you think that this is such a lofty ideal that it is um, it's something that people are actually achieving, or something that people can only strive towards? Like, do you think Goethe himself or any of his heirs, like Thomas Mann, actually achieved Bildung, or is it just a kind of continuous pursuit, but it's a type of perfection you can't actually become?
Yeah, well, I think it is that, and that's it's a concept with a kind of noble and incredibly tragic um, end, because it's so bound up with Germans, what Germans call the German Sonderweg, like the special path. It's so actually a really good place to think about where Bildung kind of goes wrong or the problems with it is to read Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, which has a lot in it about the culture of the German middle class and where it leads, why Germany in the early 20th century is a fertile place for all kinds of ideological problems beyond the obvious things we know about collapse, you defeat, and all those problems. There are sections in Hannah Arendt's that book which are a brilliant description of this kind of almost psychosis around ideas, this obsession with ideas and ideals as a way of kind of of redeeming the world, transforming the world around you. And if you go back a few decades earlier, Bildung, it's so associated with the German middle class and this kind of the culture of the emergent German middle class. But what happens to the German middle class as the 19th century goes onward? It kind of loses prominence and power. It's taken over by kind of industrial elites. Um, During the unification of Germany, you have kind of what is seen as the culture of enlightenment and Bildung, the Kultur Nation, as they call it, separate out from the political world, where it's much more about kind of conquest and power and confidence, and so the German middle class is sort of disempowered. And Thomas Mann's a really good person to read to get a sense of where that story ends up. Someone who was absolutely brought up in the culture of Bildung. His reflections on, for example, the legacy of Friedrich Schiller and his poetry written after the war. There's a lecture he gave about a kind of marking anniversary of Schiller, where he talks about how Schiller was, a great lover of kind of humanitas and is a great person to read now, as in after the kind of collapse of values in the Second World War, someone Germans could go back and recapture. And Thomas Mann's novels are full of sadness and regret in a way for the way in which that kind of German culture, the German ideal sours and gets transformed into something quite different. The discussions in Dr. Faustus, his last sort of really significant novel, features a modernist composer who does a deal with the devil, who's in some way emblematic of this cultured personality who trades morality for power. But there are so many discussions throughout the novel because it takes in these decades of Germany's ascent to dominate European power politics. And it talks about the optimism among young people, how they believed that Germany could be part of a way of reshaping Europe. It's a replacement for the French ideals which went so wrong and which have not led to the places they told them they would. There's so much optimism and idealism, and where does it lead? Kind of to defeat and moral catastrophe. But there was something about the love of ideas which led to that place, unfortunately. So I think that there's always this problem for us as cultured human beings. We want to increase our power, increase our knowledge, and increase the ways in which we can transform the world. But that also there's also stuff we can't control, and what the problem with things like German idealism, as much as it is, I think, an incredibly beautiful tradition that offers us a lot, and we can get into that, it offers us a lot as modern human beings. You do have to kind of keep your feet on the ground and think a bit also about just the pragmatic reality in which we live. And if you take, for example, the town of Weimar, which is so associated with these thinkers, the culture of poets and thinkers. It's a small town near in Thuringia. And it was just a small little courtly village before people like Goethe and Schiller turned up to live there. And if you read the history of Weimar, there's been a great book published in the UK recently by Katja Hoyer on the kind of Weimar interwar story, kind of telling the story of the Weimar Republic through the lens of that town. It's quite emblematic in a way of what goes wrong for Germany, in that you've got a town which only ever acquires prominence because of its association with certain ideal frames for how we think about what human beings can achieve. It's then embraced by the Nazis massively in the late 20s and 30s because it, in some way, it's a kind of reminder of the exceptional journey that Germany has been on. And it becomes a kind of cultural hotspot for Nazism. But I think Germany it's useful to talk about Germany beyond Weimar and that story because Weimar is so often motivated as a kind of key kind of morality tale of Western life at the moment. And actually, Germany offers lots of other ways to look at the present and kind of eerie resemblances, which are nothing to do with the story of cabaret or that kind of thing. So yeah.
So speaking of the eerie resemblances or the parallels we can draw, we have this ideal of Bildung, this classical ideal of self-formation, and it starts to like the seeds of how it can go wrong are there from the beginning. But how is it going wrong today? You've written about how it's being replaced by a sterile cult of productivity. So how is it going wrong in terms of the good things about it that we're losing if we're turning it into something that it shouldn't be? And or how is it going wrong when we are trying to fulfill it as it should be, but we fall into the same traps that other people have over the centuries?
I think there are two ways in which that kind of inner questing on the one hand and the external world on the other, which Bildung is all about. It's kind of, if you read Schiller's essay on the aesthetic education of man, it's all about saying that there's a bridge we can build between our inner youthful dreaming and the kind of degraded outer world. And in going through this process, we can in some way both redeem ourselves, but also redeem our environment and other people. And it's interesting you say is like, do these guys like Goethe and Schiller, secularize a religious ideal? And that is probably in large part what they are doing. I think, the two ways in which you can see that there are lots of attempts to try and do that at the moment. On the one hand, there's the kind of inner questing, and that's absolutely, in the West anyway, bound up with the popularity of mindfulness, which just comes in a centuries-long engagement of the Western tradition with Eastern philosophies and the language of Eastern philosophies. And it's enormously popular. I think there's nothing wrong with it. If you want to look at an example of mindfulness from kind of German literature. You read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha or any of Hermann Hesse's books, which sort of take these kind of German frameworks of Bildung and then reverse engineer them through contact with his translations of Eastern philosophy and Vedic tradition. And these are interesting attempts to reconcile these things. And I think mindfulness is perfect because it is already a kind of global tradition in that sense. It's already been something that's been formed through contact between West and East. So there's that on the one hand, which I think is sort of fine. And then on the other, there's a kind of cult of the body, a cult of physical transformation, which is, it is incredibly extreme aspects of Western life at any rate. This kind of obsession with dieting, physical productivity, training, a kind of adoption of professional standards of kind of athletic ability in people that have, do not make a living through being fast or skillful throwing a ball.
Yeah, and in your essay, the decline of Bildung, you talk about like exercise apps that are encouraging people to kind of maybe over optimize athletics in their lives. Or you mentioned Duolingo as an example of people are trying to optimize for learning a language, but it doesn't really set you up to learn a language the way most people do, which is through awkward conversations with real people. Are you familiar with the philosopher C.T. Nguyen?
No.
He's been making, or he recently was making the rounds because he had a new book come out. So he's like on the podcast circuit. And so he's been on my mind. He has this concept of value capture that he talks about, which reminds me of the way you're writing about the decline of Bildung. So value capture happens when you're trying to measure what you value, but metrics are imperfect. So you risk optimizing for something besides what you actually value, the way these apps might not be helping us actually learn or accomplish what we want. One of his examples is academics use citations to determine how good a paper is. So the more citations, probably the more useful the paper. But over time, academics could be doing things to increase their citation counts without actually improving the quality of their research. The original value of doing good research gets captured, and now the value they're actually optimizing for is just the number of citations. So the metric, because we want something that is intelligible and portable, like a metric we can give somebody else who's not in our little bubble that we can communicate with, just necessarily simplifies so much that we just end up losing sight of what we actually cared about in the first place. We're just kind of trying to game the system. So what do you think about this concept? Like, how would you integrate that into this sterile culture productivity that is watering down Bildung for us?
Well, that's absolutely what's happening. I mean, if you look at, and this is it's sort of written into the structure of a lot of the ways in which we engage with technology.
Mm-hmm.
Google was set up by obviously like smart Stanford's people who were used to working with academic papers. It's literally how Google was set up in the beginning to boost stuff that's cited more regularly on the basis that it tends, it's not a foolproof measure whether something is good or not, but it tends to be a decent guide, in academic terms. So, that has probably shaped the way we've all experienced the world of ideas and how we do our research for a long time now. So I think, a lot of these things optimize for you to be good at the pattern that it's asking you to complete. And that's not really necessarily anything to do with the world of the intellect, which happens in a human space and on a kind of human time frame. We and that kind of brings us back to this idea of like unsettling the frame. You know, if you're coming to the world of ideas from a position of feeling incredibly unsettled and you're looking for answers and you're kind of constantly driven to optimize your responses to certain questions, you're not going to get very good answers because the point about an intellectual process is it doesn't work like that. You are not necessarily looking for the right answers. Um, you might even want to make mistakes because mistakes are quite interesting.
Hmm.
Sometimes the worst things you write, I'd say, are things that you pick up later and shape into something else. But if you're not willing to make mistakes and to get stuff wrong, then the kind of intellectual journey is maybe not for your kind of personality. If you can't tolerate that. And if you look at, say, large language models and AI, they are not tolerant really of those kinds of gritty problems in um, how you actually learn things as a human being. They always want you to get to the right answer. They always are striving, even when they're apologizing for trying to be definitive. They always kind of optimize to be definitive and striving for that. And it's actually exactly this problem of our reach exceeding our grasp. Um, you know, we're not here as human beings to produce vast amounts of text in certain patterns. Like that's not what reading and ideas actually is about. It's actually about your relationships with other human beings, how much you affect them, whether those interactions are good or bad or productive. Um, the intellectual journey is not how many essays you can produce in any given decade with how many words put in particular order. Which at some points you sort of look at the way technology is leading us. That feels like the incentive. I mean, it's like Substack. It's a kind of obsession with producing and producing and producing, of showing kind of
Hmm.
text and text. It's sort of it's untethered. And I understand. I mean, I see it the whole time as an editor. I see people constantly using large language models to do references for them, in the sense that if they make a literary reference, they clearly just put in, oh, well, what does,
Mm.
Carl Jung say about the shadow or something like that, and then produce a kind of pat definition. And you're like, what? That's not the. I'm not interested in the pat abstract definition of this person. We're interested in how you've responded as a human being, when and why and where. And that has to
Hmm.
come out in the prose, even if it's not necessarily apparent. It has to be there somewhere, because otherwise,
Right.
I'm
Struggling
not
through
terribly
the
sure that
writing
human beings
process
are.
to learn what you think.
Yeah, and it's just that exactly what that problem is. What are we optimizing for? Is exactly
Hmm.
the kind of problem that Bildung should lead us to reflect on. Are we optimizing to be rich or productive or all these values? What do we want from the mind's eye? And the answer to that is often quite surprising, and especially surprising in the world of literature and the novel and the world of ideas, which really is constantly surprising to the thinking individual. And that's another thing. Large language models, a lot of the way people think now is not really geared to produce surprise. It doesn't produce the kind of kinks that are the kind of valuable byways through which you walk to actually get somewhere interesting.
Yes,
That's
which reminds me
that's a
of,
bit garbled, but yeah.
no, no, makes sense. It reminds me of what I love so much about the Enlightenment tradition and Karl Popper's ideas about philosophy of science, which we're not talking about science, but just the idea of understanding the world, and not trying to skip straight to the correct answer with an LLM, but to struggle through it. uh, Popper was all about trying to break our ideas and to prove ourselves wrong instead of proving ourselves right in order to understand how the world works. And whether it's science or literature, I think that that principle holds. And you also mentioned that this has to do with how we relate to each other. And I know that you wanted to talk about empathy, which you've written about in terms
Mm.
of how reading is a skill and what empathy is, which the definition I think that we're all intuitively familiar with is that empathy is feeling with somebody to actually vicariously experience their emotions with them, as distinct from, say, compassion, where you can feel for someone in a bit more of a removed kind of way. Um, so I want to throw out another person's like hot take on empathy. And I'm curious how you would incorporate this into um, your criticism of the way people talk about empathy as this kind of moral virtue you might attain through reading literature. Like reading literature can make you more empathetic, and we view that as making you as a good person. So the research psychologist Paul Bloom wrote a provocative book a while back called Against Empathy. And he argues that empathy has a dark side. So when you empathize with one person, it often comes at the expense of another. And I'm just going to give you one of Paul Bloom's examples. So I'm quoting him here. Quote, empathy is activated when you think about a specific individual, the so-called identifiable victim effects, but it fails to take broader considerations into account. This is nicely illustrated by a classic experiment from 1995 published in the journal Personality and Social Psychology. Subjects were told about a 10-year-old girl named Sherry Summers who had a fatal disease and was low on a wait list for treatment that would relieve her pain. When subjects were given the opportunity to give her immediate treatments, putting her ahead of children who had more severe illnesses or who had been waiting longer, they usually said no. But when they were first asked to imagine what she felt, to put themselves in her shoes, they usually said yes. So empathy, as we conventionally understand it as this moral virtue, even with our conventional understanding of it, it has this dark side that we don't often think about, that it can come at the expense of somebody else. So I want to throw this at you because you bring up empathy as we conventionally understand it, and you make the argument that that's not why we should be reading literature, that it's not going to give us that kind of empathy. And you discuss empathy as an aesthetic standard instead. So can you tell us how we should understand empathy as an aesthetic standard? And then also what you think about what happens when we try to become more empathetic in the conventional sense, and how literature can take this quality that has sort of underrated dark side and maybe accentuate that dark side even.
But it's a very interesting word because it's so often um, in many of the recent kind of public discussions of uh, literacy and the whether we might be entering a post-literate society, and in that light, trying to think about what is good about literacy, what is good about well, I don't. I think people don't necessarily mean literacy; they mean being literate or being well read, or reading certain kind of books like novels. So, in almost every discussion like that, people start by saying, "Well, the great thing about novels," and it always seems to be novels that people talk about rather than other forms of non-fiction or philosophy or poetry. It's always novels for some reason. They say, well, novels they don't make you good. You know, novels can be funny and sad and evil and everything. But what they do is they put you in someone else's shoes, to quote, and um, that in some way builds this idea of empathy, which everyone nods sagely and goes, "Oh yeah, empathy is great. You know, we all must be empathetic," and that tends to be how the discussion ends because everyone it's a sort of discussion ending positive note. Okay, great, we can all become more empathetic. Now, this strikes me as sort of odd in lots of ways. Number one, because empathy uh, is a relatively new word in the Anglophone world, which was only really invented in the early 20th century, some 200 years after the novel is a kind of formal apparatus in which we kind of develop our ideas of the world. You know, I mean, if you look at the 18th century history of the novel, people might well have said the novel was about bringing you into a providential identification with the divine, you know, with God. You know, it would be nothing like, oh, I'm thinking myself into someone else's shoes, even though people like Daniel Defoe were kind of these comedian figures who produced texts in lots of different people's personalities. People were actually, I think, quite suspicious of that ability. It was seen as quite kind of, you know, Defoe, for example, is sort of seen as a bit of a shapeshifter, as someone who's a bit untrustworthy, as a bit of a
Mm,
liar. It's not seen as a good thing.
disingenuous.
But yeah, it's and we sort of accept this as part of the art of the novelist that maybe being a good liar makes you good at identifying with other people's mental patterns. So I think there's a lot within the history of the novel that falsifies this idea that thinking yourself into someone else's shoes necessarily builds other moral values. But then
Yeah, well,
the
that's
other thing
actually
about
another thing Paul Bloom talks about, that you have to be highly empathetic to be a good torturer or spy or seductress or any number of occupations that we don't think as being so synonymous with the good.
exactly, well, I mean, to return to Daniel Defoe, the guy was, I think, quite an admirable person in some ways, but he was very flawed, and he was a spy. He was someone who was involved in kind of the some pretty lot of skullduggery in the high politics of his day. He was, a kind of big flawed personality. But empathy is something that only comes into English in the early 20th century, and it comes from an attempt to transliterate another German concept, which is called Einfühlung, which is like one feeling, like a identification. And Einfühlung is a concept within the kind of German aesthetics, and it's a good example. If you want to understand what Einfühlung is and how it plays out, is to just watch any of Werner Herzog's documentaries. Now,
Mhm.
Werner Herzog's documentaries are not necessarily about the pragmatic truth that say if I was an English person or a British person doing a documentary for the BBC, the aim would be to produce a pragmatic account of what actually happened. But for Werner Herzog, he's not interested in that. He says, all I'm interested in is ecstatic truths, my poetic truth. Which again is not something, if we were to set out to make a documentary, that would be a remarkable thing to say you wanted to do. And people would just sort of look at you, what are you trying to do? But it's all about, for him, and if you watch, say, a documentary like Grizzly Man,
Yeah.
or which ends with a kind of almost sublime sequence of images and spoken words by Herzog himself, talking
And
about
it's
the
very
kind of
tragic.
collapse.
For
Yes,
those
yeah,
who haven't watched Grizzly Man, it's about this man who goes out to live with grizzly bears. He becomes convinced that they're basically his family. He thinks that he's saving them in a kind of environmental conservation sort of way, but also very much has a religious valence to it, I think. So, and then in the end, he is killed and eaten by these bears he's lived with. So very tragic. Um,
yeah,
yeah, it's I
yeah.
think probably my
He's
favorite
mad.
Herzog documentary.
It's brilliant, but he's Herzog is, yeah. It's Timothy Treadwell is the kind of is the filmmaker in a way. So he shoots all the footage, and then Herzog edits it and puts it into a kind of narrative. So again, it's this complex relationship with truth that is not necessarily, if we wanted to watch all of Treadwell's footage, that could have been an option. You know, someone could have come along and just put together all of the unedited footage, and we could have watched it. But that's not what Herzog is necessarily interested in. He's interested in the moments in time when boundaries seem to collapse between man and his environment. And Treadwell is a living example because but he actually lives with bears and reflects on it.
Hmm.
And we can see him reflecting on, his struggles with that, his loneliness. That Herzog talks about how he's one of these people who have crossed an invisible borderline. And for Herzog, these are the people that interest him. You see that in all of his films. He seeks out people who have violated some law, whether moral or tradition or even divine. It's or people who have a fate which is extreme. So I think his best film is a documentary he made about deaf blind people. It's one of the few films he actually made in Germany, in this at this point in West Germany. And it's a very beautiful film about people who, are locked in to a kind of dark world. But through the filmmaking, he shows their reality, which isn't necessarily dark at all. It's this kind of they don't identify in that way. The people in the documentary talk about the inner voyaging they go through, the kind of divine silence they interact with, all these things. So many of Herzog's films are absolutely, even though he's someone who left Germany really when he was quite young and has made very few films about Germany, he is to me supremely German filmmaker in the way that German concepts, the hopes of the culture he was brought up in still kind of run through the films. And again, so if we think about empathy in literature and art, I don't think the novel necessarily is designed to develop that kind of ecstatic form of empathy. It's a kind of inner reverie um, that may or may not lead to certain personal insights. And I think that's what the novel is about. And if you take an extreme example of someone who is the a kind of extreme literate personality, be Marcel Proust, and the narrator in Search of Lost Time, who is a kind of inadequate person. All his love affairs are these kind of slightly hopeless, strange inability. It's a kind of constant inability to interact with the world in the way that some of the other characters in the novel do. The narrator is always slightly imprisoned within the kind of magic of the word. Um,
Yeah,
and he
in
sort of
your
looks at
you talk about this more in another piece, The Perils of Hyperliteracy. And there you write, quote, the highly developed literate mind's relationship to the world is that reality must be seen from a distance to be converted into judgment. And you warn that this is not an unvarnished good to be highly literate, in part because it makes you a kind of aesthete, an artist, or maybe a pseudo artist. You write, quote, aesthetic refinement can lead to moral weakness if precision and discernment are used to avoid the messiness of real human encounters. And then you give us some examples, like you just mentioned, of Proust. And we can all conjure our own examples of the tragic artistic life. And I'm an artist, so I'm going to ask you a loaded question. What's so pathological about us artists? What do we weigh this trade-off against? So like, what's the value of being highly literate that we get for our pathologies? Who is this worth it for?
yeah, I think the pursuit of art is a pathology. Yeah, it's like a deeply, not in a sort of big tragic romantic way, but that you are consciously severing yourself from your environment over time to produce something new, and I think that has certain costs. Um, it may be a journey which ends up you kind of overcome certain problems that leads you back to the world, but I think it's a hard thing to do. And I know about writing. Um, I think writing is a kind of. I think the writer Robert Louis Stevenson referred to the art of writing as mastering certain arabesques of space and time. And arabesques are a good word because it it's not a natural structure. It's a kind of creation of the mind and a creation that we have made as human beings. And I think mastery of those things is produces a sense of purpose and mission and power, but it's only it's only peripherally related to other human beings. It's only related to other human beings when they absorb it in the right way and can then interact with you about it, and then you might come to certain new conclusions. But no, I don't think there's anything bad about this about being obsessed with aesthetic refinements. In fact, I love Proust's In Search of Lost Time, and I love this way of writing. But I do think it is, it needs to be balanced off with kind of the earthier elements of existence. Otherwise, you do risk becoming obsessed with a certain kind of accessing the world. I think
Mm-hmm.
highly cultured people should always um, try and get away from the word. They should be skilled in interpreting music. Some of the best writers are art historians. I think it's because you've got a kind of different tradition you're attempting to translate back into the word, and that gives you a sense of discipline. So I think it's always good to get beyond like this kind of, especially the obsession with the novel. I think that's a very strange thing. Of sort of the novel is always held up as this kind of ultimate way to write or the most important, and I just find that a bit weird. Um, you know, history, philosophy, poetry, these things are just as valuable, sometimes harder. I think maybe the novel is maybe easier, so it's
Mm.
more easy to get into. It's hard to read like
Easier, but they're
dense.
often so long, people feel like they're accomplishing something challenging.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that sense of accomplishment is a really important part of being literate. Like, I don't. I'm a bit skeptical when people say, "Oh, you shouldn't." I don't know how to put this. Like, it is satisfying to get through a book and to look at it and go, "Well, I read that." But I think reading lots just makes you get better at that process, and it is an art and a skill, and that's good in and of itself. But I don't think it builds moral. It doesn't build these kinds of empathetic. To come back to this idea of empathy, of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. That's you you get that through religious experience. Maybe you get that through having friends. If you want to go and learn about other people, go down the pub or speak
Mhm.
to someone. Or, it's like a lot of this stuff is a kind of replacement for stuff that maybe used to be done a little bit more collectively. And you can't weigh the novel with all that other stuff, which kind of needs to be done in the moment. Um,
It's a very
and I think
solitary task to read a novel.
I
It's
think
not like
the
going to the
novel.
theater. You mentioned the opera as being this really polar opposite of the novel in terms of involving so many people to make the production happen, from the performers to the people collecting your tickets to the audience themselves. And compare that to a novel where you sit in a quiet room, ideally a quiet room all by yourself. That's the ideal.
Which is lovely. I love being on my own in quiet rooms, but it's um, you only peripherally. The magic of the novel is that you're doing that alone, and you don't need other
Yeah, your
people because
projection.
yeah, it's your inner, and other people are other people are frustrating and constantly difficult, and these friendships are hard and relationships are hard, and we kind of need to work at all these things. Reading is great because you just get better at it through doing more of it. I mean, it's not really like those other things, which are sort of non-linear. So, but no, I think the opera is a good example. You also need to be polite to people when you're at the opera. You have to say please and thank you to the person collecting your ticket. You have to be courteous to other people. You also realize how much your experience is affected by other people being annoying at the opera or the cinema. You realize that a person can destroy your inner experience like that by behaving badly. So it does that as well. So it can build respect of what we can achieve together. It also can make you feel like, oh God, other people are,
Yes.
are irritating.
So we have so much anxiety right now, and you mentioned you feel like this is particularly acute in the UK about being in a post-literate society, or becoming an audiovisual society. And I see that here in the US too. Maybe it's like across the Anglophone world. I'm curious why you think it's particularly acute in the UK. Um, but more broadly, I want to know, what do you think are the downsides we should really be concerned about with a post-literate society, or given the fact that being highly literate is not an unvarnished good, what do we gain when we deprioritize it a bit in favor of the audiovisual? Are there any silver linings to this as well?
So yeah, why is it worse in Britain? Because in spite of Britain actually being at the forefront of the expertise that's built a lot of the ways in which um, large language models, AI, a lot of it was built by smart people at UCL, people at DeepMind, which was bought by Google. Um, we really feel like a lot of these transformations in the kind of intellectual and cultural environment are being done to us. We are on, we are like the German burghers in the little courts looking at Paris and England and London from a distance and saying, what is going on? We don't know what's coming next. Or we're like the people in the early parts of War and Peace in smart St. Petersburg salons talking about what's Napoleon going to do next? What's going to happen out there? And we look at America and China, and we are constantly wondering what are they going to do to us next? Because that's where it's very obvious the main innovations that are happening are being scaled and are becoming reality. It's not that innovation isn't happening in this country. There's amazing technological scientific expertise, and actually a lot of the innovations in AI were actually built here. It's in America though that the capital, everything is coming together. There's the energy. There's all the things that America can do that Europe can't. It's a big place with a common language where people can move easily. I'm not in America, so I'm just sort of I'm like one of these people saying what's going on over there. I'm trying to work it out. But so I think in Britain, it's because we're not really embracing these opportunities, and it's partly we are, and partly we're quite resistant to it, and it's partly because we don't feel ownership by it because it's kind of happening over there. So I think this anxieties are really acute. I don't think there's as I think if you look at America, it's just a bigger intellectual environment. Like there's stuff going on. It's incredibly dynamic. Here, it's less easy to see the kind of green shoots, the new ideas happening. Part of that reason is the BBC is such a massive information creator and dispenser in the UK. So it kind of crowds out other stuff. Um, there's actually lots going on in the UK in terms of media and in terms of new things happening, which are deeply literate, which are deeply in the tradition that we all apparently care about. The magazine I work for, we could not have done it without the internet, without new ways people are interacting with their cultural and information environment, to say it in a horrible way. But we couldn't have done it without the stuff that people are blaming for the decline and fall of all that we hold dear.
There's
So
Substack you mentioned earlier is another example of that.
yeah, I
It's
feel so much
it's kind of
better
creating
informed.
this little bit of like a literary renaissance, I think, in New York right now that is very centered on everyone's Substack publication.
I feel so much better informed about what's happening in my country and what's happening in global culture because of things, as you say, things like Substack, writers I would never have come across, or might not have even got a look in the legacy media. So, the cost of entering the kind of cultural and intellectual run has massively gone down, obviously, um, and that is a real danger for institutions. And I think a lot of the anxiety comes from institutions because it reveals it's a kind of moment of truth. One of our writers, Daisy Christodoulou, who's based here in London, who's an education expert, wrote a great piece for us about large language models and the historical parallel with the sale of indulgences
Mm.
just before the Reformation. That it kind of what large language models do is they kind of democratize cheating. So cheating before was actually something that's quite difficult to do. You'd have to pay someone else who maybe already had a degree in the thing that you were trying to pass at to write something. You'd have to then translate it into your own words. That's gone. You can do it in 5 seconds with a large language model and get it to a standard that gets you a pass. So what does that reveal about the nature of the thing that you're trying to pass? Well, it doesn't feel exactly very hard or worth all the money that you spent, or the great liberating thing that we like to think education is. If it can be gamed like that, it looks like a false exercise, and that's a massive problem for universities. They need to think about, well, if it's so obviously undermined, doesn't that say something about like how we're teaching and what are we teaching and how are we testing ability? And and maybe that involves going back a simple fix like going back to oral examinations.
Mhm.
But
Written
again, that
tests.
costs
Yeah.
written to that costs for a lot of universities. Their whole model now is probably gone away from that. That's expensive. They rely on getting huge numbers of people through the system who aren't really given much teaching. They're given access to a library,
Yeah.
and they get the social benefits of like I've gone to uni, or the prestige, middle class prestige that people want from uni, and then people go out and they suddenly realise, oh, all this stuff I've paid for hasn't really given me any real skills, and it hasn't made me a very worthwhile employing either. So it all looks a bit redundant. So yeah, I think that I've kind of forgotten what the second part of the question was, but I think Britain, yeah, people are quite pessimistic about the literacy stuff for those reasons, that kind of slight sense of powerlessness. Um, but then I think where literacy decline is concerning is not necessarily on these kind of cultural value problems. It's more these kind of specific pragmatic, like what do we actually use literacy to achieve? And would our society be less productive if we had a smaller pool of those highly literate people? If the number of people who are, we're not talking here about the end of literacy. We live in the most literate societies we've probably ever had,
Yeah. So to
in general.
distinguish between literacy as just like knowing how to read and like having a basic standard education versus being highly literate, being this kind of aesthete.
Yeah. But the question I think that is important is how important were those highly literate people
Yeah.
in the past? Was it really necessary to have, say, 8% of the population to be incredibly highly literate as opposed to 6%, which is probably what's
Yeah.
happening?
So what do you think about that? What percent would you, just as a ballpark, aim towards? At what point is there some kind of elite overproduction or the pathologies of the highly literate end up taking over the culture in a nasty way?
I think we need far fewer really high literate people. These people are terrible in politics, for example. Right? British, to give you an example,
Yeah, you
that
Brits are
British.
your politicians are so much more highly literate. I always thought it was funny when people would compare Boris Johnson to Donald Trump when you have Johnson going off, quoting the Iliad in the original Greek off the drop of a hat. So this is highly literate performance
Mm.
that British politicians give the world. Um, it's interesting. It's a unique part of your culture.
Yeah, it's terrible, and he misquotes it quite badly. So it's just sort of bollocks, that stuff. I mean, it's yeah, he Boris. That's a good example because they are often compared. So Boris has been through, he's passed almost every test that the British public school and Oxbridge establishment ever set for him. On paper, this guy is a top person to put into government and politics in the public sphere. He went to Eton, the best school, the most competitive school, the one with the highest academic internal obsession, or one of the top. He then went to Oxford, the best, one of the top two universities in the UK, especially for humanities. He did classics, which at Oxford is called greats. It's not even called classics; it's called greats because it's the kind of it's probably on the one hand for technical reasons, but also because it's seen as a kind of training for life. So and then he goes
That's Bildung
into
again, right?
exactly. It's like he passed every test that our wonderfully literate and highly literate elite wants him to pass. He then goes into public life and he sort of gets through it through this combination of outrageous levels of self confidence and sense of destiny, which these institutions have also given him. And he displays this kind of learning at times. He gestures towards this thing of like, oh, I'm. He was asked once of what he did when he was prime minister how he relaxed, and he said something like, so I read Greek lyric poetry in my spare time. And, I did classics university, and I just think that's nonsense. Like, no way are you sitting reading, the kind of minor Greek poets, and it's just a ludicrous thing to say. But anyway, so he's passed every test. But then in power, he's venal, he's useless, he can't get stuff done. He only ever gets stuff done because other people do it for him. Um, he has never been used to running anything real. He was a journalist and then came into power as London mayor. London being a mayor in the UK is not like being the mayor of New York or the mayor of a great city where you have real power, and you're a real figure and you deal with real budgets and you have to square the circle and you're put under pressure. Being mayor of London is nothing like that. It's not.
Mm.
You're just doling out money, really. Anyway, don't want to talk about Boris too much, but he's quite emblematic actually of the British hyper-literate problem. Is that there is this assumption that many commentators and people have at the moment that Britain became a leading power in the world because we had the best elite, most highly educated elite, the elite that knew the classics really well, that knew the classical models, that was the best educated and also the best at doing stuff. And that is not true at all. The British rise to global prominence happened before the construction of an elite around education and ideals. It happened in the 18th century, in the early 19th century,
Because of the
when
Industrial
our
Revolution, right? First
yeah,
industrialize, you take over.
and our politicians were not chosen because they were super intellectual. That was just not. They were chosen through patronage networks, and they were chosen often because they served in the navy, which was about having to, um, you know, deal with all kinds of. This is the kind of frontier technology of the day. Trying to deal with all kinds of problems that are to do with the real world, to do with men and logistics and economic realities, and how do we fund this? How does the debt work? And we the rot sets in actually, and this is a um, this is a kind of actually quite common view actually, is that the rot sets in with the creation of the kind of leading public schools, who are these kind of elite training grounds, often with an education rooted in the classics, and influenced by these kind of ideas of paideia and Bildung, and then with the kind of systematization of that in politics, this selection for government through um, meritocratic systems, where people are tested on these kinds of access to this kind of world. And it's not served Britain very well, and it explains a lot of the deep problems that we faced as a country, and the deep problems with the state. Even during the First World War, the people who bail out Britain from a basically incredibly disastrous opening to the conflict, in which we've come very close to going on the path of losing the war altogether. The people who have bailed them out are people like Maurice Hankey, who's the first cabinet secretary, which is the top leading civil servant role at the time. He had a training in the naval world. He didn't have an intellectual training. He was a soldier. That's often been the pattern, that the very well educated and intellectual elite leads the country into near ruin and disaster, and then it's saved by people who have a different skill set.
Men of
But at the
action
moment,
instead of men of letters.
oh yeah, but at the moment, it's a very common view to say that we were better governed because we had more literate elites, and that is not true at all. We were worse governed because we embraced the idea that the art of politics could be done by people who were very, very well educated. There's a good example that's often used with the British PM Harold Macmillan, where people say, "Oh, he was wonderful, wasn't he?" He'd say to his ministers in a meeting, "Oh, just forget about the problem. Go and read Livy, and go and immerse yourself in the history of Rome this evening." I'm thinking, we'd have been better government if people in the cabinet had read less Livy and spent more time focusing on the deep problems we had. So, it's just this idea of the well-educated person. I think that there's and kind of it has direct resonance with this concept of Bildung and what the point of education is and why we should embrace. I think we should embrace things like Bildung and we should embrace certain elements of that ideal, but we should embrace it for our own personal reasons, for our own sense of where we think our life is going to end up and what we want to do with life, and not for these kind of big, especially these kind of big geopolitical political problems. Um, and the answers there are quite different. We need in politics people who are thoroughly ruthless, who have a dogged sense, have lots of other values that are not necessarily covered by uh, uh, being cultured or anything like that. Maybe Bildung has it can mean different things in different avenues of life, but I would quite like politicians who are much less well read, frankly. I mean, our new PM, who's going to come in a few weeks, Andy Burnham, did English literature at university. So there we are.
So you're apprehensive.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I don't know. We'll see. But yeah.
so when you, like I mentioned to you before, I really appreciate that you approach, you clearly value being highly literate yourself, but you still approach it in a nuanced way. And we have been talking about the downsides a lot. So it sounds like you think the value is just very personal. It's how an individual becomes kind of like the best version of themselves for themselves on all of these kind of holistic metrics. So, um, as we are allegedly entering an audio visual society, and are in this decline of being a highly literate society, I'm wondering, what do you personally mourn that we're losing? And, but then also, I do still want to keep talking about the benefits, like what silver linings do you see? You yourself host a
Mm.
podcast, and I want to know more about what you think of how podcasts are an existential threat to books and how you feel about wielding that murder weapon yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is about the podcasts we do at Engelsberg Ideas is that they're almost always tend to be rooted in, I'm interviewing an author. And we have a strong policy in the office that if you're interviewing someone about their book, you've got to read the book first. It's not always the case. Most journalists take a pretty, because journalists are busy, and I understand why. There's always this joke, oh, just read the intro and the conclusion and it'll be fine.
Now we have the
Um,
LLMs, you can like tell us what this
I
book
know,
is.
and yeah, but you can really tell when someone hasn't bothered sitting down for a few hours and just reading something. I mean, it's just it's very obvious. So we kind of think about the audiovisual as leading as something that's lovely to have, but ultimately takes you back towards the word, just as a
And do you
way of
think that's
consuming.
successful? Like, do you think after listening to the podcast, what percentage of listeners do you think are going to follow through and read the book?
Oh, not in that sense. Yeah, I very few. I mean, I read. I'm terrible for this personally, in that we publish so many reviews, and I've edited and read the review. I think, oh well, I'm not going to read the book now. I've spent a couple of hours of my life already working on the thing. Um, but that's just because I'm a journalist. I work with words all day, and there is only a certain amount you can do. And there are, of course, proxy ways of getting information that don't involve having to sit with a long text. There's nothing wrong with getting an idea of a subject through listening to an old episode of In Our Time, the BBC show that we have here on the world of ideas. It can orient you in the right position. It can get your minds, the cogs whirring. Sometimes one of the speakers, the way they talk about something will just light something up in your brain. which may then make you think, well, I want to read something they've written, or I want to get deeper into the subject. So, what is it about what we're losing is the million-dollar question, because I don't think necessarily it's straightforward to understand what we're losing in politics, because I think the problems, again, I'm just speaking about Britain, the problems we have are not because we've not got literate people in power. We do. They're really literate. They spend all time reading. They were educated at universities where this was massively prided, and they passed all these tests that show they're really literate. That's not why. It's because of certain class problems, kind of certain problems around the establishment. It's often because people are overrating their kind of insights because they are highly literate and they've passed all these tests. So I don't think that's necessarily the problem. But I think if we get into a position where the number of people in terms of there's a kind of just particular way, I think, of writing and seeing the world that is clearly hyperliterate, that has been nourished with decades of um, interaction with text, that then expresses itself in writing and has a kind of directness and acuity and incisive quality that you just know the writer is really comfortable with words and is really comfortable with them producing verbal expression. It's like, you watch certain musicians, some of them are really just technically good,
Mhm.
and they might be the
Virtuosos.
first violin. Exactly, they might be the first or second violin in an orchestra. The soloists tend to be something special or different. Um, Take pianist Sviatoslav Richter, one of the greatest pianists ever to live. Listen to the way he plays um, Schubert, or especially Schubert. It's like you're listening to Schubert again for the very first time, because the interpretation is so radical and so different to anything you've ever heard, and he pulls it off. He's so technically good, but he's also in a mysterious way interpreting those lines of black dots on a page. So yeah, maybe music's a good counterexample. In an orchestra, you need lots of people who are technically good at reproducing the sounds and the patterns. That doesn't mean that everyone is a genius, but you do need a certain number of people who are good at working with that stuff. And I think with writing, I've definitely seen in my career, and I'm very early in my career, but I've been working as a journalist for 8 or 9 years, and in that period, I've definitely seen the quality of written expression decline significantly. Just among people my age, of people in general, in terms of that pool of people has definitely got smaller. So if you want to be a writer, you should read all the time, and you shouldn't think that by watching films or by listening to music that you in any way replicate the process that great writers go through, which is reading loads and loads of stuff. If you want to be good at writing, people might not, but if you want to have very good verbal expression, read widely and read in lots of idioms, and actually, even better, try and learn other languages. Read in French or German or anything. Just anything that gets you out of your frame, or your prison. Anything that expands your vocabulary, anything that kind of adjusts your mental frame over time. That's the joy of literature. It's coming across a writer who puts something in a way that you hadn't come across before, even though it's just the same old emotion.
It
That
gives
is
you that
joyful.
epiphany feeling of someone's articulated something that you knew somehow deep down to be true, but you hadn't been able to explain it to yourself before.
Yeah, which is just about communication. I think what literature retrieves is always there. Literature doesn't give you new experiences. It gives you that sense of, it retrieves something that was gone as far as you knew. Um, that's what great novels do. They bring you most clear, most directly back into yourself, into your past, to everything that's made you that person sitting there in the moment with the text in your hand. And that's the point. And I think
Yeah,
the
and this is part
indirect,
of Bildung, right? Where the self is having an interaction with the world, and a novel is one of those interactions, and that you are testing yourself against, and you cultivate yourself against.
exactly, how often do you, I mean, I always find this, how often something just, some aspect of like something that happened to you, maybe a relationship or a friendship, or, it, and you're reading and suddenly something clicks and you suddenly see it in a new light. But it's often in a funny way, the thing that always, you kind of always knew. And I think that's the other side to it. I think I don't think it ever it always surprises you and also just brings you back to this kind of sixth sense that you always kind of knew something about that experience. Um, and I think that's a really great feeling. And that's immensely pleasurable. And that clearly unlocks something about the psyche that is
Mm-hmm.
that is maybe not beneficial, but something that is rich and complex. And I think with literacy, I would like to be able to discuss these artifacts of the human mind with other people who've read quite a lot and have read stuff, and to do it in a way that mirrors like our, you know, I mean, I feel very lucky because I read a lot as my job, but I do understand people are stressed and they are busy and they have lots of, everyone has responsibilities to other people, and it's not always easy to set time aside for reading. And things like podcasts are great for you're on the go or cooking. There's nothing wrong with it. Um, so I do think anyone who is able to work in kind of reading and writing and enjoys that process of both reading and writing and then talking about the stuff you've read and writing, comparing like with like, trying to get to an objective sense, which you can only really do with other people. I mean, not that there are any objective judgments we can make about literature because it's always changing, but you can get the satisfying sense that you have come to some kind of new conclusion that is felt by
Mm-hmm.
someone else through talking to them about it. And to me, if that pool of people in people's lives is maybe smaller than before, but is still got enough people in it, that's not necessarily a problem. And actually, I feel really positive with things like the kinds of discussions that people have on our sites or in forums like this, that the internet has produced infinite possibility for meeting people who are aligned to your way of looking and thinking about the world, and want to explore what that means. Um, you know, I think it was well known the degree to which the internet brings together subcultures, both good and bad. We
Yeah.
often talk about this sort of negative thing, but we don't talk about the train spotters who might have found a whole new community of people who are into train spotting and then go and meet up and go and watch trains together. Like, there's huge numbers of these people who have discovered for whom the internet is really helpful and has
Mm-hmm.
liberated them. So I think there's all kinds of parallel stories going on, and people love to be. I think we should be, try and be optimistic about things, even when we're being pointing out what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We should be quite optimistic and say, human
So
beings have had
what's
lots of new abilities in the past. There's no reason why we can't make this work,
so
and be a
what's the
bit more
most
satisfying.
optimistic thing in your opinion about our ascendant audiovisual culture that is arguably taking over the literate culture?
Well, audiovisual. I mean, I think that there's extremes with it. No one thinks that it's great to be on your phone for 9 hours a day watching reams of 30-second long clips. Like, that
Mm-hmm.
obviously doesn't make you either good at your job or a good person to be around, or like, it certainly doesn't make you a productive person. So if we're talking about Bildung, that's certainly not something that's eventually going to lead you to becoming the self-realized, mature person like Willem Meister at the end, you know. So that's, you know, obviously not great, but there's a big cultural shift going on at the moment where people are rejecting that in public and in private. Um, you know, I think it's getting more and more taboo to play music on in public venues like public transport, which is often where people interact with other people on these devices. I know it's a kind
Yeah.
of cliched example, but it's where you see other people actually using them. So that's why I think people focus on it. And then in private, it's very, very common for especially middle class people who are sort of driven and activisty on this to say, "Oh, I don't, you know, I limit screen time for my kids. There's no
Hmm.
way they're getting." So, you know, these things are changing. Um, but on the plus side, maybe is that there's nothing wrong with oral culture. It just demands us to be more eloquent in our speech and to have a bigger memory. You know, oral culture depends on people repeating patterns, on people being aware that you know, people having patterns that other people can respond to. Um, I think this is why there's quite a high premium on social cohesion in an oral culture, because it's sort of like we all need to be on the same page to get things done in a
Hmm.
way that with a kind of literate society is quite different. You know, we all agree about the text being a verifiable thing that we then agree on. It's not the same as looking someone in the face and saying, "Do you believe the thing I believe?" Because I have no other way of accessing that. And I think we are getting a bit more into that, which is maybe not so great. And I often hear, oh, that consumers of media like watching podcasts or like seeing people on video because it gives them a sense that this person is a real person, is an
Maybe a
authentic
parasocial
person.
relationship.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, they're not lying in the way that the text lies. And I think that's a
Mm.
I've heard that before, and I think it's a very deep rooted thing in more oral cultures to say, to distrust the text and to say, you know, it's, you know, the text can
It's maybe
lie.
too
And actually,
polished, too removed from an actual experience of a human being.
yeah, and it's sort of challenging to that tribe thing of, and if you look at kind of cultures where you have, there's plenty of Europe, which of plenty of Europe where historically you've had a bit more of an oral culture than you know, Anglophone culture is very wordy, verbal. It's very, very United States, great example, one of the most text-driven societies on the planet. I mean, if you look at the astonishing amount of text media produced by 19th century America, an incredibly literate place. Um, and I think in parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, even somewhere in some ways like Italy or Spain, you do have a slightly different relationship to the power of the word, partly because of religious experience. You know, these are not cultures that are built around ecstatic images as much as the word. They're built around collective religious experience in a way that is still felt in quite a vivid
And is
way.
this a Catholic and Protestant divide where the Protestants were the ones who decided, no, we should be reading the Bible directly rather than taking the priest's word for it? So there's this direct relationship with the text that was not part of the Catholic tradition.
Absolutely, and I think that in a funny way that I think has it shapes a lot of our responses to things like to get a bit controversial, things like the rise of what people call woke, which has been
Hmm.
so spectacularly successful in the Anglophone world, Australia, Canada, um, the US, and the UK, and I think is absolutely nowhere near as successful in France, for example, where it has a completely different vibe. You know, when French people say le wokisme, I think they're describing something slightly different, something a bit more old school, something to do more with the kind of radical politics of their own country. And there is a kind of resistance built in that if you have a population where the English, you know, English language is not the common everyday speech. You're not engaging as directly with these concepts. And I think there is something, I know, this is just speculative. There is something about woke in the way that in an interesting way, it really obsesses about language. It
Hmm.
ascribes like a level of power to language, which is like a kind of magical quality to particular speech acts,
Hmm.
um, and and particularly and particularly written expression, and says that if we modify the way we write and describe the world, we can modify all kinds of things. And I think only in a very hyperliterate culture could you really believe that.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think would really believe that in all cultures. It would just play out in a very different way. But I guess the point is, what would an audiovisual world be like? Well, we know this because for centuries we lived with a much more audiovisual world pre-Reformation. Um, it put a bigger premium on memory, on rhetorical eloquence, particular rhetorical models that people would use. Um, and people were probably better at working out how, what images meant and had a much bigger mental vocabulary of um, the image. And to get back some of those things, I wouldn't necessarily think that would be bad. In some ways,
Do
I think
do you
there
think
was a
that
study.
one? Do you think that one or the other is better for cultivating Bildung? We talked about how, the novel is one example of how the self is interacting with the world, testing itself against the world to cultivate Bildung. How do we do that in an audiovisual society? Is this um, if you can do the same thing through different means, or is one better suited for it?
I think they're all pretty good for that. I mean, I wouldn't. Again, I just don't think reading writing is that much better than say getting involved in the classical tradition of music or spending a lot of time with paintings. I mean, again, as I said, I think some of the best writing is by art historians, um, and I think it's because they're in some ways affected by these images and are kind of trying to see how the word relates to this other media. And I think that's quite a good stabilizing device. So if more people, I think it's all about balance, and that's another kind of building thing of how do you create a balance between all these different sensory and physical impressions that we constantly feed in, and how do we create balance between the kind of sophisticated kind of artifacts of intellectual culture. So, otherwise you risk either being a bit of a bore, only being interested in one thing, and not being great
So
conversation.
Bildung is a
Say,
bit like being a Renaissance man.
yeah, it's just not being not. I think it's about not overdoing it on any one thing and saying this is the final solution. It's sort of constantly being open to new formulations and ways of looking. I mean, film. I think I've certainly discovered film as an adult. I didn't really watch that many films when I was growing up, but that's been massively transformative the way I see the world of actually just going to the cinema, loads and loads and loads.
Mhm.
Did I think that was something I'd do later on in life when I was a kid? Probably not. But I don't think it's made me like less literate. I think it enhances certain elements of a literate mind. Um, you know, I, if you're exposing yourself to the kind of, as you say, things that have a certain quality and in the right context, I don't think audiovisual life is bad at all. It's like that ridiculous argument that was had over the Odyssey about Elon Musk either listening to
About the
it or
casting
reading it.
choices.
Well, I can't remember specifics, but it like was it because there was then a debate about whether it was better to read or listen to epic poetry. Um, and it's obviously neither. It's good to do it in whatever way, and listening to it might be great if there's a good reader, it can be really thrilling. And these things were designed to be read, so maybe it's worth getting the authentic experience sometimes. But it's also good to read this stuff.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I feel quite. I think the eloquence thing. that's the thing that I'm worried about, because podcasts are really, a lot of them are about conversation, and podcast seems to be one of the main ways in which people attempt to consume or get into the world of ideas. I know you see that an enormously popular podcast like The Rest is History,
Mhm.
um, which is run by two Brits, and they, that's heavily scripted. It's pretty learned, but it is also a conversation, and conversations are often about filling time and are just, you're kind of saying stuff for the sake of it because you're trying to get on with another human being in the present.
Mhm.
And I think people persistently overrate the value of conversation in terms of,
Mhm.
like, as a kind of value. I think conversations are great and are ways of us getting stuff done together sometimes. Um, to say it in a kind of weird way, but you know, if you go to an event where there's lots of great conversations, I think it's nice in the moment, but it's quite hard to then go away from that and feel like you then apply it. Um, and I think that's just because a lot of conversation is just filling time. Whereas in an oral culture, the conversation, you'd have to put an extreme premium on being super eloquent. That's why in epic poems you're often repeating formulations. You're often using the same phrases to keep the listener engaged, to constantly engage the listener in this kind of deep interaction. And I absolutely don't see our kind of elites, especially our political elites over here in the UK, investing in being highly eloquent as a way to get your points across. It's sort of just more of the kind of slop kind of way of
Mhm.
talking. And actually, it's sort of aspirational as well. People kind of want to talk in a kind of, sorry, that kind of conversational thing is sort of kind of taking over a lot of stuff. And I'm not sure that's great if you want to listen to people having conversations and have a sense of community and all the nice things about listening in on a conversation. But I don't think it's necessarily an intellect. It's not that positive on the intellectual side of things. Um,
And
but
you've also expressed concern about podcasts being this existential threat to books. Um, and you write that the risks are very serious. A public that is only here for the plot when its interest settles on politics or history will find itself confused when the story doesn't go its way. As you talk about how podcasts tap into our love of storytelling, and that's maybe part of how they're superseding the novel as the storytelling medium. And but the way a plot is constructed in a traditional story, whether a novel or something older, versus the way it's told in this kind of conversational register you're describing is very different. Um, so tell us a bit
yeah,
more about that and like, what you think we should do about books. Like I personally, I think one of the best values of books, the reason I want to write a book is because if you write something book length, then you get to understand something that you've struggled through the process of thinking it through in the writing process at such length that you know a topic so much better. I don't know if there's, to me, it seems like the absolute best way to understand something. And I would be really sad if less people were going through that process. Feels like we're going to maybe lose a lot of knowledge.
well, a book is you over time, so that's why it's not just you now. It's you over days and weeks and months, um, and that's what's kind of interesting is you're seeing that space and time thing going on. And podcast conversations are, let's say, I mean, it's obviously slightly paradoxical while we're having a conversation to say that conversations are not, but they are kind of limiting. Like that, you're it's hard, expressing yourself in verbal ways is difficult. And a lot of people aren't that good at it. And so they fall back on kind of conversational patterns, like everyday conversational patterns. Because expressing thought in the moment
The
is actually very
spontaneity.
difficult. Holding, we're just not built for that. I mean, I know very little about cognitive science or anything, but do our short-term memories, we can only hold so many things in our working memory. And our long-term memory is vast. And I think that's probably something to do with being molded by literature. We are really used to this idea that this kind of sense of retrieving stuff from this big kind of storehouse inside, in the moment. And the quality of our ability to do that depends on how you're feeling. It depends on uh, you know who you're talking to. It depends on just so many atmospheric things. It
Yeah.
depends on nerves. It depends on loads of things. Whether you sound authoritative, uh, endless. Whereas writing is quite safe in a way because um, you are, um, it's you over time. You can come back to it. You can have a cup of coffee. You can go away from your desk. You can come back to it. And I think there's something that a kind of contemporary journalist of mine said, which I think was quite a good observation. This guy called writer called James Marriott. He wrote a piece a couple of years ago about why, in the age of the podcast, people don't get. It's harder to cancel someone when they say stuff on a podcast, uh, as opposed to in print, because it's kind of there. You can retrieve it. You can just type in what did they say XYZ time. Whereas most people don't listen to podcasts like that. And actually, if they hear something that's a bit controversial, unless they can like clip it
Hmm.
and then like put it out or something, um, it just fades away. Um, and so it's just this totally different relationship to time and space in the way if you privilege conversation and these kinds of interviews over the experience of meeting someone in a kind of solitary position who's really grafted over the sense of time and everything. you know I think it's a confusion of what we need conversation for. I want to do that with my friends. Let's have a conversation that is fun and engaging, and may or may not make you think differently about life. Like, I don't know if any, I mean, I certainly don't necessarily go to my friends to have to learn loads about my self. Maybe I go to it for fun. Maybe it's quite a British English attitude. You're basically seeking for people who make you laugh and maybe make you feel good. But I think a lot of the key insights that you have are in when you're alone. Um, I think Nietzsche said something that the greatest insight you can have come in your quietest moments, not the loudest ones. And I think podcasts are always striving to fill time with noise, and that's not necessarily going to lead to like a really deep insight. But you can
Yeah.
feel in the moment thrilled and kind of like you're part of something. And I think that's not a bad thing to feel. It's just sort of, I don't know if that's like an intellectual process. It makes you feel good in another way.
We're a social animal process.
Exactly, and that's great. We are social animals, and I think we should have much more of that in life. But in real life, you
That's
should
the other
have.
great anxiety of our time, along with the decline of literacy, is the solitude and the decline of socializing.
Yeah. Well, it's again to come back to the beginning of our conversation, this unsettled lens. But at the moment, we don't really know how to be alone. We don't really, and we're struggling with company as well. We're struggling to be in company, and both these things are interacting with each other to make us feel unsettled, I think. And I think
And that
all we need, yeah,
I would say, and then that sociability is perhaps also part of Bildung, part of how we are ourself is interacting with the world, testing itself against the world.
yeah, this testing idea. I mean, it's like, yeah, I just think if you're seeking to build, empathy, it is much better to just get to know people outside of your skill set and develop respect for them. And I'll give you an example, um, which is rooted in what I do. I'm a writer, journalist. I work at a magazine. I'm an editor. My job is completely different to what it would have been 50 years ago in several respects. So one, almost everyone I work with as a journalist has been to university, often has several degrees, um,
It
often
used to be
has a
more of a working
degree.
class profession, right?
Well, it used to be seen as a trade, not even as a profession at all in the UK anyway. I think America maybe slightly different um, approach to journalism, but like it just certainly wouldn't. Nowadays you can do masters in journalism. As
No, I
if
think that's the
they.
case in the US too. Not I'm a writer, but not a journalist, so I might be mistaken. But my impression is it used to be a field you did not need a degree to go into. We had a lot more local papers. So there was this kind of like master journeyman apprentice unofficially sort of system where people would just come up through the ranks and it was seen as a kind of a more dirtying your hands kind of profession than an elite's profession.
Absolutely, and you become really good at writing, kind of verbal, that kind of yeah, you just become really good at it. So the people who worked in the old tabloids, like the Sun, famously, if you went into the Sun office in the 1980s and 1990s, it would have been full of people who were incredibly bright. These things were not produced by people who were like thuggish or trying to say rude things. It was produced by people who were absolutely brilliant, and because they kind of come through a practical process. And the other difference with the old system was if you were a newspaper on Fleet Street, the editor would be on the top floor and the printing press would be on the bottom. So, and as a journalist, you would have to work with um, typesetters. You'd have to work with all kinds of people who just didn't have the kind of cognitive skills that you'd been working on, but they had skills which you needed, and you'd develop a respect for people. And I think, you would end up thinking that these people were just as important as you, and are, if not more important than you as this kind of cognitive person. So that's all gone. It's now very, very graduate heavy and middle class. And in my we have a site and an app. The people I work with on the infrastructure are developers and fantastic people, but they're not necessarily. They're probably from kind of similar worlds to me, similar social worlds, and there's no kind of physical infrastructure which brings you into contact with people who have just a completely different set of skills, but ones which are just as valuable. And I think that's probably happened to a lot of professions and to a lot of trades. But with journalism, I think it kind of, because you're producing stuff and you're writing it, it's so easy. It's like it shines a spotlight on that problem. It's a massive problem in the UK where our elites are constantly blindsided by what goes on in the country, by political events that seem to be happening to them. And then you think,
Mm.
well, who's in our media and political elites? A lot of people who have sort of had quite a similar upbringing and have been taught to value really similar things, and have certainly not been told to value people who work with their hands and work and are highly skilled. That is just not something that for their children, they would not want their kids to do those kinds of jobs, because they have been brought up in a system which rewards cognitive head work. And I don't think it's improved the quality of our politics having that kind of hyper literate personality as the one we pride. I think it may have improved some trades or some professional work and some elements of our services sector, but it's certainly
But it's
not
put
improved
blinders
our
on the
politicians.
journalistic profession.
It's certainly not improved journalism. I mean, journalism is much poorer. Don't want to slag. It's maybe not nice to slag off journalism, given I am one and lots of my friends are, but certainly our culture is much less, is a much less true portrayal of what's really going on
Yeah.
now, or a less interesting one. Maybe the old version was wrong for interesting reasons, but I do think that this kind of cognitive achievement problem in journalism is really bad.
So we are only about 5 minutes out from when our end time is supposed to be, and I want to give salon participants a chance to ask questions. We have one in the chat um, who asks, I had after who after reading your essay on the decline of Bildung, was wondering how much of um, Bildung activity in the 18th and 19th century was elite activity. Increasingly today, work involves mental effort, albeit of a different sort, which may make the added mental effort of Bildung even more challenging or difficult. And that's actually kind of dovetailing with what you're just talking about, how elite it is or is perceived to be. So what do
Mm.
you think of Bildung as an elite activity versus maybe something a bit more egalitarian?
It's a really good question because I think Bildung was a mark of decline. It was people fell in love with it because it appeals to people who were disempowered and were not in control and were blindsided by life. And it's a great compensation in a way, um, and produced a lot of intellectual energy around working out what that compensation would look like. You know, what would it mean to not feel powerless, to feel like you were free to choose and to choose to be free, as Schiller
Mm-hmm.
kind of writes. So that kind of work, which really came from a sense of sort of being on the wrong side of things, I think I think it's a good thing. You want to we want to find ways of coping with that distorted lens. Um, our answers will probably be very different to the ones offered by the scions of Weimar classicism, but the process is one that is really important. We should as human beings try and respond to if we do feel a sense of powerlessness or a sense that the lenses through which we're trying to interpret the world are not reflecting the world, are not getting us closer to to other people, the world around us. So I think in terms of the culture of scientific achievement, I don't think it is an elite activity. And the other thing about which we didn't touch on actually, the other thing about 19th century Germany is that it was an incredibly important time for the sciences, and the German Enlightenment um, produces so many of the things that we rely on. I mean, you can almost name fundamental aspects of modern technology. So many of them are produced by people who have extraordinary people from the German lands who often were born in poverty, who had access to education and to often through the church and through these kind of pietist orders. Um, and you also had people like Wilhelm von Humboldt, um, who were kind of brought up within a kind of Enlightenment ideal, and then went out into the world and did all kinds of discovering and adventuring and stuff. So there's two sides to it. I think it actually wasn't this. I think it was something that played out in all kinds of ways, but the sciences were certainly where you could just point to loads of really concrete interventions which radically improved life and were
Mm-hmm.
often done by poor people who had access to a kind of self formation um, that absolutely was part of that culture. But political elites, I don't think that's maybe I don't think that was really. I think that was again the problem with Germany is you just have this horror separation between culture and politics, which in a way modern Germany is very like this. On the one hand, you've got German culture, and on the other, there is the German political scene. There are the big industrial concerns. Um, they really are very far away from each other, which is a problem. Um, and indeed,
It
their
has.
politics is a kind of strange parlor game. They have these
Mm.
left and right parties, but ultimately, the conflict is a historical one that they find difficult because for obvious reasons. There are
Yeah,
major
yeah,
disruptions in the German story that that make that painful or even impossible.
yeah. Um, the a kindly euphemistic way to put it. Um,
Yeah,
do we have any more questions from salon participants? And then after that, Alistair, I want to give you a chance to express any thoughts you feel like we didn't get to but should have. All right. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
this is.
Thank you so much. I don't think I have a question necessarily, but just afterwards for, yeah, some comments would be great.
Sorry, you just want to make a comment? Go for it.
Yeah, okay. I don't know, I guess that was an introduction to Bildung, so thank you so much for that. And it was a lot to, yeah, I think take in as well. But what I'm getting from it was just the that it's worth the effort to make for yourself to go through the harder things, right? Rather than kind of like the easy AI answer for you. So if you read the full novel, if you go and participate and have those conversations with people, then that's worth the effort for yourself. Um, then I guess, yeah, where is the future going when, I mean, is it up to us to individually find that and navigate through it? Because the easy options are sort of everywhere, if we choose to take them as the tools are available for us. And it's just, I don't know, I see it as a new form of technology with AI. And of course, it can be useful, like the internet, it's fantastic for some people, and then other people use it for, you know, terrible purposes. Um, so it's just a general, I don't know, comment on where my brain is right now on reflecting on all of the discussions too.
Yeah, I think that's a great comments. I mean, it's on the you're right. I think I'm also very sensitive of like people's lives are complex and difficult, and it's like what David said in his comment. You know, uh, you know, work and mental effort and all these things are not like it's hard, and people's lives are very busy. And in a sense, if you look at like a lot of the, if we think of kind of the intellectual activity of former times, yeah, a lot of it is quite done by people who have a lot of time. They're not the people sort of having to spend hours every day doing physical activity. Or that does happen, but it's really, really exceptional people. It's tiny numbers of people who are capable of doing both. And I think with contemporary knowledge work, that's really hard because you're in this thing for hours a day where you feel like you're engaging your cognitive abilities, but it's often for things that make you feel a bit kind of feels a bit illusory, or you don't really feel like what the end point is. And then you go home and you think, oh well, I've got to produce more mental effort to like get nourish myself culturally, whatever. And I think that's definitely the wrong way to think about it. In terms of that won't be very joyful, and it will probably be quite counterproductive. So I think when we talk about like literacy, a lot of the answers, I feel very unsatisfied with a lot of the answers at the moment that are given on that kind of literacy problem and the problem of like what would a culture of achievement actually look like nowadays, because it does emphasize this kind of reading will be good for you. And it may be good for you but not in ways that you expect. And also, it, I think I'd really imagine you're reading a novel. How often would you actually absorb or really engage with what you're reading if part of your brain was always telling you to engage more fully with it, or that this is good for you, or this is this is worth engaging with, or this path, it's just it gets people away, I think, from that fundamental youthful joy of what it is to interact with the physical world and the external world, which after all, reading is an interaction with an object. It's a physical process, and that yeah, that yeah. So I think no, I agree with the direction of your comments.
I don't know if this is a good cheat code or how you feel about audiobooks versus reading books, but my personal way of trying to get this holistic edification is to listen to the audiobooks at the gym so I can not just be my body atrophying while I'm pursuing the intellect.
I do that as well. Yeah, audiobooks are great. I just can't. It's just depends on who's reading it. And
Yes,
sometimes I just find
absolutely.
it unbearable, um, and sometimes it's a bit like, you watch a film of. I'll give you an example, like the John le Carré novel, The Spy Who Came from the Cold. You know, there's a film version of that novel with Richard Burton, and for me, after I watched the film, I always thought of, and I've read the novel again after that. I just, it had changed from my own version of
Mhm.
the character he's playing into kind of basically a kind of Richard Burton uh, facsimile.
Mhm.
But I felt that was really nice, and I didn't feel like I developed a less sophisticated response to what I've been reading or anything. It's just sometimes these visual things audio overcome our own experience, and vice versa. And I think if we do that, um, I think it's quite good to actually to listen to novels that we really like and decide whether we like it or not, because that produces that judgment quality again.
Mm.
Well,
I think,
why don't we like it?
yeah, I only use audiobooks when I actually know a book very well. And then I feel like, oh, I can just get into the voice and I'm really familiar with the actual book, so it's really enjoyable. But if it's a first time audiobook, I just don't think I can make it.
Mm.
Yeah, the
Yeah, I
concentration.
find I find it really difficult. I just lose the thread all the time, which again is kind of illustrates this thing about conversation. It's really hard to follow the threads of, often things are for the backgrounds if you're listening to them, because it's not structured in a way that is, if you listen to an epic poem where you have the kind of, um, every 30 lines you have the same words, which prompts your mind in that way. Of course you're going to remember it better. But novels are not like that. I mean, we wouldn't want a novel to be like that. It'd be weird. Um, but yeah, But then maybe, that's what our. If we spent a bit more time thinking about rhetoric, and I think that's the thing that worries me a bit more, is that people not necessarily putting a premium on quality of expression, even when, in theory, being in a more oral culture, we really need to decide that that's a pretty important thing to worry about, so that we can then go away and do the things we talked about. Um, you know, if we're not going to take notes, we're going to all have to remember a lot more stuff, um, and then decide how we're going to then act. Because without it, we'll just forget and then just mooch around.
I think I'll take that from our conversation, and in the future, it will just spark Bildung in my mind again in the future.
Great.
So thank you so much for that overview and the depth as well of that. I feel very
Thanks,
put
mate.
in.
Sounds like you feel inspired, which is lovely.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you.
And Alistair, is there anything you feel like we missed? Any like burning point you want to make before we end the salon?
Mm, not really, but maybe this idea of the salon. That's it's kind of similar to Bildung in a way, because there's a kind of tradition of the salon and there's pros and cons. Um, and I think it's useful to use. I guess what I'd say is, like, if we do this sort of thing, and if you do the sort of thing that Bildung was or engage with it, these kind of quite rich concepts, there's so much going on there. It leads you into all kinds of, like, weird avenues. And it's a bit like engaging with any element of the canon, like any particular author. It often just leads you into like unexpected places. Um, And I think the salon is about like that. Is if we want to do the thing that was the salon again in a new way, that leads us into unexpected like ways of doing stuff. And I think it's the same. If we ever, I think, and German culture is useful because it has these concept words in a way that is very uh, interesting to engage with. And if we do engage with it properly, reveals quite a lot about our own like mental concepts and kind of world of ideas because it's quite. You know, I think someone once said that the United States spoke in English but thought in German, something like that. So
Say that again. The
because
United
that
States did what?
spoke in English but thought in German because of the
Mm.
appeal of certain kind of German concepts, especially in business. Like there's a huge influence on US business culture that's taken from the kind of old like, German industries.
The university
Some
system comes from Germany.
absolutely, and also in a sinister way, things like management consultancies have their origins in like, Nazi economists and stuff. But yeah, so but these concept words are really useful, and I think also engaging with the German story apart from Nazism and Weimar and everything is great. It's something that us as Anglophone people should engage with, because and for any European tradition, any global tradition, anything that has been important to human beings at one time or another is really important. It happens that I'm more familiar with like Germany and France, but that's because I'm from Britain. But it is just true of anything, you know. I just think that's good, and it gives a kind of more richness to the conversations we have in the present. And so much
Hmm.
of what we do is molded, by curious things that happened hundreds of years ago, and by you know, a good example is that concept of empathy. People do invoke the history of that word when they use empathy, like it or not. And you I think that's maybe the literate thing is if we want to have better conversations, I think it is useful to know where words come from, to have a feel for words, for their relative like weight in a sentence, and to use them properly.
Yeah, not
So I
just
think maybe
to take the good vibes we get from a word like empathy and stop there.
yeah, which I understand is such an easy thing it's kind of what we all want from a lot of conversations, to say the thing that other people kind of gets and sort of nods, and then we sort of that's it. So I understand why people like that feeling of sort of invoking a reference, and everyone nods. It's like when people say, "Oh, I've got an Aristotelian view
Hmm.
of like life," and everyone goes, "Oh yeah,
Oh yes, of course. That
wow."
sounds so elegant.
Mm. Uh, and no one actually just then asks a secondary question because it would be awkward to go like, "Well, what do you actually mean by that?" Because no one wants to
Yeah,
put
like,
the
do you share
spot.
his views on slavery or like,
Yeah,
which
I know exactly.
Aristotelian
It's like,
views?
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah, people are things, you know. But yeah, but I think that's maybe an aspect of building.
Well, thank you so much, Alistair. And